Hello and welcome to LYF Bible Study. This is Lesson 24, Pesach, or Passover in Hebrew, where we'll be going over today the Last Supper account in Luke's Gospel. This will actually be our last, I hesitate to use the phrase pure Lucan account, because we've been supplementing Luke with the other Gospel narratives as necessary, but we've relied so far, and we will today, primarily on Luke's chronology and Luke's account of Jesus' life and ministry. After this week, we will be going into Jesus' trial, we will be going into Jesus' death and resurrection, and we will be quite freely switching between the different gospel accounts because each of them has something unique and important to tell us about these issues and these events, and I think it's worth getting all of their perspectives. So, as always, we'll start with a bit of review. Last week we read about Jesus' cleansing of the temple, which was yet another way to raise the ire of the Sadducees because he had hit them where it hurt in their wallets. We also saw Jesus engage in halakhic discussion with both the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as the Pharisees try to trap him with the giving him of a denarius, where he says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, render to God's the things that are God's. He also engages with the Sadducees, who try to trap him about the resurrection. They try to trap him about marriage using the Torah, and Jesus rebukes them. And finally, he goes back to the Pharisees and talks about what is the greatest commandment before finally answering the question that began that discourse, well, what authority do you have to do these things? Well, he gives them their answer by saying, I am God, I am the Messiah, of course I have the authority. And even though the Pharisees are intrigued, the Sadducees are angry, no one is attempting to engage Jesus further. So we're going to pick up right where we left off with Luke chapter 20, verses 45 through the end of the chapter, and going into chapter 21, verse 4. Then in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples, beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes, love greetings in the marketplaces, the best seats in the synagogues, and the best places at feasts, who devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. These will receive greater condemnation. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw also a certain poor widow putting in 2 mites. So he said, truly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all, for all these out of their abundance have put in offerings for God, but she, out of her poverty, put in all the livelihood that she had. So the scribes that Jesus is referring to here, it could refer to the Sopharim, the more Sadducee-aligned scribes who focus on the Torah. It could also be taken as a broader condemnation of all the teachers of Israel. It's not really important who he's specifically referring to here. It's more important to focus on the message and the image here. And what Jesus is saying is that he's condemning those who walk around and talk about how important they are, who use their faith basically as a show of righteousness. They want to be recognized for their faith. This is something that Jesus has done multiple times throughout the gospel accounts. He even referenced the Pharisees with the size of their tzitzit and how they love to be seen at prayer and make a big deal of their faith. And then he also goes on to uphold this example of a poor widow whose faith is given and exemplified in her actions. It's also worth noting that God is not a consequentialist. Jesus is making that clear. God doesn't care about how big your contribution is objectively. He doesn't care about the size of the acts that you do, because none of them are necessary for him. What he cares about is the motivation and the spirit that underlies these actions. God knows men's hearts. He's not about the result as much as he is about the intention behind the result. So this woman who is given 2 mites, essentially 2 pennies, a very small sum of money, has relatively to herself given more, even though these scribes who are richer, they could be fulfilling the 10%, we don't know, the tithe commandment, but even though their barest obligation vastly outnumbers the monetary value of this widow's contribution, she is showing more faith because she's giving more and she's sacrificing more. So it's not about results. It's God. Remember, God doesn't need sacrifices. He doesn't need the temple. He doesn't need all these treasures that the temple holds and that the Templar system uses. He wants righteousness. And in fact, this is exemplified in the book of Proverbs 21:3. To do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. Call to mind Psalm 51, I believe it is. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit and a contrite heart. You do not delight in sacrifice, or else I should surely bring it, but you do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. The idea is not about the actual actions, but the motive and the spirit that underlie them. Moving right ahead, Luke 21, verses 5 through 6. Then, as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations, he said, "These things which you see, the days will come in which not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down." This is a short passage in the Gospel of Luke. It is expanded on in St. Matthew. It becomes a part of the trial of Jesus, because Jesus basically says, I will tear this down and raise it up in 3 days. But Jesus is specifically prophesying here of the destruction of Jerusalem, and as we talked about a couple weeks ago, it does literally occur. But what he's saying is also going to be highly offensive. This is a historical reproduction of Herod's temple, the temple that existed at the time of Jesus. This is another from the Israeli Museum. And it's worth noting that the temple that Jesus is talking about is in many ways relatively new. It is still considered a part of the Second Temple era, in the sense that it is built and expanded on from the temple that was built in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah with the return from Babylon led by Zerubbabel. But it's also something new. The temple that was first built here upon the return was nothing much to write home about. In fact, when we read the Old Testament and it talks about the assembly being called, we hear that the older men and women actually weep at the consecration of the new temple because it was just so inferior to the original temple of Solomon. It had lacked the grandeur of the original temple. It had lacked the artifacts, most especially the Ark of the Covenant, the Urim and Thummim, the holy oil, and the sacred fire that God himself had kindled when the first temple was consecrated by Solomon. Herod had rebuilt this temple, and it had only really finished about 20 years before Passion Week. It had been a massive multi-decade product. And even though there was some controversy with Herod, trying to put an eagle in it, and there was some controversy because the money Herod used was kind of viewed as dirty, the temple is still the center of Jewish life. In fact, there had been, between the Old and New Testaments, there had been a war to liberate the temple that had resulted in the creation of the Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of Rededication, which we see Jesus celebrating in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark. Because the temple, even if this temple was built by dirty money, it was still the temple. It was still the center of Jewish life. And this is why people are marveling at it, is because it's relatively new. Some of these people, when they were growing up, would have gone to a very different temple, and now that they've seen this thing completed, they're marveling at it. It was an architectural wonder. Herod brought in a lot of architecture and building strategy that had not really been accessible before. It was a beautiful building. But even more importantly, and this is what Jesus is getting at, the temple is the center of Jewish life, including the second temple, and it has been for 500 years since the return to Babylon. Judaism, as Jesus would have known it and as it later evolved after Jesus, centered on this temple. The numerous traditions were created around this second temple. It was the pride of Judea and of all Israelites. The Sanhedrin meets in its courts. The Psalms praise it, both the original and the new temple. Teaching is done in its course, and above all, it's where sacrifice is offered. And that's really important, because Jesus is saying this around Passover. We don't know what day of Passion Week necessarily he gave this teaching, but regardless, it's during the time of the preparation for Passover. There are hundreds of thousands of people bringing their sacrifices to the temple to be inspected. They will later be sacrificed on the 14th of Nisan. Again, an untold number of lambs and goats are going to be offered here in just a few days' time at Passover, a holiday that is in many real ways the center of Jewish life. And so for Jesus to say that this is going to be destroyed is just utterly unthinkable. Like, imagine if we were told that this ongoing COVID-19 situation means that we can never, ever, ever go to church again. And that's kind of what Jesus is saying to them. It is the epitome of the subversion, in the sense that the Messiah is not supposed to talk destroying the temple. He's supposed to talk about making it even more glorious and reigning from it. And God's going to come back and light the fires. There's going to be the New Jerusalem centered on this perfected temple. What Jesus is saying would have essentially been taken as something akin to blasphemy, something similar to blasphemy. And we've already discussed how Jesus' words come true. We talked about that when Jesus lamented over Jerusalem. To this day, there is only one part of the temple that still exists. It's an outer wall. Some people do think it may have been part of Fortress Antonia. I maintain it was part of the proper temple. Regardless, the Temple Mount is gone, and what sits in its place are two mosques. And it's also worth noting that the destruction of the temple ended, I hesitate to use the word Judaism, because modern Judaism is something very distinct and emerges after the destruction of the temple. So I'm going to call it the Tanakhic religion. It's not Christianity, quote unquote, because Jesus hasn't come yet, but it is the true religion given, from Adam all the way through the end of the Old Testament. That ended because there's been no more sacrifice. There could be no more sacrifice. And what we know of as Judaism emerges in response to that loss and centers in many ways around that loss. Passover itself centers around that loss now in many ways. And there's a reason Jesus is giving this prophecy now, because what Jesus is about to do is going to render the temple obsolete in every real way. Jesus is going to fulfill the sacrifice system. He's going to fulfill the sacrificial system. He's going to be the final sin offering, the final atonement for sin, the true paschal lamb. There will be no need for a temple anymore. But that's just not thinkable to them. And yes, there will be a third temple. We know this in the book of Revelation. In fact, in rabbinic Judaism, there is the idea that the Messiah will have to rebuild the temple. And that, without the Messiah coming, there should be no third temple, which is why, even though Israel has existed as a modern nation for over 60 years at this point, I believe pushing 70 actually, or over 70 actually, that no one has seriously talked about building a new temple, because that is wrapped up with the idea of Messiah coming. But even with this third temple that we know will exist in the book of Revelation in the New World, it's not going to be the same, because it won't need to have sacrifice, not in the sense of sacrificial atonement. It will instead serve as a center of praise. It will still be a fundamental paradigm shift from how the Israelites at Jesus' own time would have been thinking. Now, of course, there's some distress about this, and they ask Jesus about it. So moving ahead with verses 7 through 18 of Luke 21. So they asked him, saying, "Teacher, but when will these things be? And what sign will there be when these things are about to take place?" And he said, "Take heed that you be not deceived, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and 'the time has drawn near.' Therefore do not go after them. But when you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes in various places, and famines, and pestilences, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. But before all these things they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons. You will be brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake, but it will turn out for you as an occasion for testimony. Therefore settle it in your hearts not to meditate beforehand on what you will answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries will not be able to contradict or resist. You will be betrayed, even by parents and brothers, relatives, and friends, and they will put some of you to death. But you will be hated by all for my name's sakes, but not a hair of your head shall be lost. By your patience possess your souls." So, again, this is kind of Jesus taking this last opportunity to tell them, stuff's going to happen and it's not going to be what you expect. He is once again subverting the messianic expectation. His Talmudim are not going to be princes of the world. They're not going to rule beside him, at least not immediately. We'll get to that in a little bit. But there will be hardship and persecution. The Messiah will not immediately make all things new. There will be a time of tribulation. And this is something they can't necessarily understand because Jesus hasn't necessarily suffered the things that he's prophesying for them. And remember, Jesus is about to suffer the exact things he just said to them. They will hand you over to the synagogues. They will hand you over to kings. You will be put to death for my namesake. Well, Jesus is about to go through that, but he hasn't yet. They don't quite understand what's going on. But again, this is in line with what it is to be a disciple. Jesus will be the first fruits, quote unquote, of this prophecy. He's going to walk through it first. He's going to do it first. And then, because his disciples are truly walking in his dust, to use the rabbinic term, of course they're going to suffer the same fate, because that's what disciples do. They follow their rabbi in all things. Again, it's also worth noting that Jesus does not promise an imminent return. The end times continue to the day I'm recording this and the day you listen to it. And the disciples' job is not to sit on tenterhooks waiting for Jesus to come, but instead focus on their calling and discern the time. Again, there's this idea, it's very popular in modern archaeology, modern biblical criticism, that early Christianity was this apocalyptic religion. And in some ways, yes, it was. Many members, of the early church did expect that Jesus was going to come again soon. They did not expect that we'd be sitting here, 2,000 years later and that Jesus would have not returned. But it wasn't exclusively an apocalyptic religion, nor did Jesus promise that he was going to return immediately. That's a misreading of the text, and I think it's a disingenuous interpretation of it. It's also worth noting that Jesus says, don't be worried when you start seeing these quote-unquote birth pains of the end times. Nation will rise against nation. Every time there's been political upheaval, I think this is especially relevant with what we're facing today in America, throughout history, every time there's been political upheaval, whether it be the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Byzantine Empire, the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, the rise of atheism, the rise of Darwinism, the fall of the British Empire, the fall of the French Empire, and I'll say it, we're looking at the fall of the American quote-unquote empire, and people immediately tend to go towards, well, this must be the end times, because how could God move on? I've even had conversations like that. Maybe you have too. If America goes, we're seeing all this unrighteousness around us. We're seeing all these awful things. It must be a sign of the end times. There are entire denominations and ministries devoted and dedicated to this idea, as if the white horse that Jesus rides in Revelation has Air Force One stamped across its haunches or something like that, and that the banner which Jesus holds and Michael holds, the archangel, is somehow red, white, and blue. It's not. Hate to break it to those people, but it's not. There is going to be political upheaval. There's going to be physical upheaval. There are going to be tragedies like COVID, just like there have been for thousands of years at this point. It doesn't immediately mean give up everything and expect the end to come. Do what you're told to do by Jesus, and when it comes, it comes. Watch and wait, but also fulfill your vocation. There's a great story about Martin Luther when he was asked, if you knew Jesus was coming back tomorrow, what would you do? And he said, I'd still plant my apple tree, because that's how we're supposed to live. Jesus also gives a few words here about testimony. I think this is also worth noting because he himself will exemplify it in his trial. Testimony has become a very major part of modern Christianity. It is something that we give in front of campfires at Christian camps. It's something that we give at altar calls, that we give in church. This is me, this is my story, etc., etc. But that's not what testimony originally meant, and that's not how testimony was viewed in the early church. In fact, you were not supposed to work on your testimony. The testimony was something you gave when you thought you were going to die. Indeed, this is why St. Paul gives his testimony multiple times, because every time he gives it, he's in a situation where he doesn't know if he's going to come out alive in the book of Acts. And Jesus will give something of a testimony about who he is when he knows he's about to be crucified and die. It's not an opportunity for speech making. It's not an opportunity for emotions and tears and guitars, ukuleles, what have you. It's an opportunity for the Holy Ghost to witness and speak through you about what your hope is and why you've ended up there. It is a response to persecution. And again, Jesus is going to exemplify this in his trials. Luke 21, verses 20 through 37. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be a great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift your heads, because your redemption draws near. Then he spoke to them a parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they are already budding, you see and know for yourself that the summer is now near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that the kingdom of God is near. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. But take heed to yourselves, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come on you unexpectedly, for it will come as a snare on all those who dwell in the face of the whole earth. Watch therefore, and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. Now, this is obviously very eschatological. It is talking about the end times, and there's an entire conversation we could have on this that would kind of distract from the purpose of this study, but it's also in the text, and we need to address it. So, a couple of things. First of all, there is a double fulfillment of this prophecy. He speaks specifically of Jerusalem and the fall of the temple. And we know that in 70 AD, the Nazarene Christians, the Jewish Christians who stayed at Jerusalem, when they paid attention to what was happening in the political sphere, and they knew Titus and Vespasian were coming for Jerusalem, they left. There were very few Christians left at the siege of Jerusalem. They knew to get the heck out of town. Similarly, with about 40 years later, I believe, the Bar Kokhba revolt, who was a false messiah who explicitly claimed, I am the king of Israel, I am the son of David. He even issued coins in his image. Well, not with his literal image, but with that proclamation. Once again, the Nazarene Christians knew this is bad news. Get the heck out of town. But this prophecy doesn't just apply then. There are also applications here to the end times and the second coming. And again, this goes back to that idea that we've talked about this time, we've talked about previously. Jesus' initial audience did not think that the end of the world could really be separated from the Messiah. They did not think that the Messianic age would be during the end times. They thought when the Messiah came, those are the end. That is the end times. It's the end of the world. He's going to come. He's going to make all things new. He's going to establish the eternal Israel. The idea of what Jesus actually did was unthinkable to his initial audience. And he highlights this by saying, there's going to be some stuff coming, and you need to keep alert. A couple of specific remarks also. This generation will by no means pass away. When he says that, this is one of those things that people like to talk about like it's controversial. It's not especially controversial if you look at the meaning of the text. Remember that the Messianic age is an ongoing process. And the Messianic age begins with Jesus' arrest, murder, resurrection, and ascension. And then that begins the apostolic mission and the end times. So what Jesus is saying is that you will see the birth of the Messianic age. This generation will by no means pass away, because it's going to start in a couple of days, and within a couple of years even, that we will have entered the full apostolic age. In fact, less than 3 months away, we're going to see Pentecost. We also see the judgment of Jerusalem occurred in the lifetime of some who were present. At least St. John is believed to have witnessed it. And it's also been interpreted this generation will by no means pass away by basically saying, once this happens, the generation that witnesses it, once the true end of time comes, once the trumpet sounds, as it were, the end times will come swiftly. The final judgment will come swiftly. Some other things that Jesus says, or one specific thing that's worth remarking on, is he mentions this time of the Gentiles. Again, this is a subversion of messianic expectation. Now, it was expected that when the Messiah comes and establishes his kingdom, there would be Gentiles who would come to God, i.e. those who had abided by the Noahide laws, essentially don't murder, don't eat blood, don't commit adultery, worship no other gods but God. The idea would be there'd be some mixing. The distinctions between Israel and non-Israel would have broken down. There'd be no clean and unclean anymore, etc. And again, this happens. It does happen. We'll see it as we move into the book of Acts over the summer and into next semester. But they expected this to happen quickly. They didn't expect there to be essentially a covenantal epoch where the church is made up of primarily Gentiles. That was not something they expected. But it's what happened. So moving into Luke 21, verses 37 through 22, verse 6. And in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and stayed on the mountain called Olivet. Then early in the morning all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called Passover, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he went his way and conferred with the chief priests and captains, how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray him in the absence of the multitude. This is a turning point. What Judas is doing here, this is a turning point. This is a major one. As always, the name Yehuda Ishkariot, Judah means God is thanked. Ishkariot means the man of Keroth. There are some people who think this might have indicated he was a zealot. Iscariot may have been derived from the Sicarii sect of the zealots. Not really any evidence for that. It just means that he's from Keriot. And that means he's most likely the only Judean among the 12 disciples. We know that he was the treasurer of this movement. And he appears to have become gradually disillusioned with Jesus' messianic mission. I mean, I'm sure that he didn't enter into the Havara that was Jesus' disciples immediately intending to betray him. We see that he's been going down, and this kind of cements his fate. And indeed, from the context, we see that the entirety of the inner circle is getting more and more distressed with Jesus. Things have not been going well from their perspective. After all, John the Baptist, Elijah, has been murdered by Herod, who's an Edomite masquerading as a Jew. The Roman oppression and mistreatment of the Jews has only increased since Jesus has started his ministry. Pilate is getting rammy, shall we say, and he's killing a lot more people. He's prosecuting a lot more people. It's becoming much more violent, yet Jesus hasn't challenged Rome. He, in fact, keeps withdrawing from challenges numerous times across the Gospels. He doesn't seek out a fight. And he's recently, right before they even entered Jerusalem, he said, I'm going to go and I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die. And they don't understand it because it's just so contradictory to their expectations. And that would include Judas. And what Judas has done here is, it's such a turning point, because the Sadducees have been wanting to kill Jesus for a while, but Judas is who gives them the chance to do that. He goes to them. They don't ask him, are you willing to betray your Messiah, your rabbi, the Messiah? He goes to them and says, I'll give him to you. Pay me. And they do. Incidentally, it's also prophesied in the book of Zechariah. If you read Zechariah chapter 11, verses 4 through 14, this is set up. Thus says the Lord my God, feed the flock for slaughter, whose owners slaughter them and feel no guilt. Those who sell them say, blessed be the Lord, for I am rich. And their shepherds do not pity them, for I will no longer pity the inhabitants of the land, says the Lord. But indeed, I will give everyone into his neighbor's hand and into the hand of his king. They shall attack the land, and I will not deliver them from their hand. So I fed the flock for slaughter, in particular the poor of the flock. I took for myself 2 staffs, the one I called Beauty, and the other I called Bonds, and I fed the flock. I dismissed the 3 shepherds in 1 month. My soul loathed them, and their soul also abhorred me. Then I said, I will not feed you. Look, let what is dying die, and what is perishing perish. Let those that are left eat each other's flesh. And I took my staff Beauty, and cut it in two, that I might break the covenant which I had made with all the peoples. So it was broken on that day. Thus the poor of the flock, who were watching me, knew that it was the word of the Lord. Then I said to them, If it is agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, Throw it to the potter, that princely price they set on me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. Then I cut into my other staff bonds, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. And the Lord said to me, Next take for yourself the implements of a foolish shepherd. For indeed I will raise up a shepherd in the land who will not care for those who are cut off, nor seek the young, nor heal those that are broken, nor feed those that still stand, but he will eat the flesh of the fat and tear their hooves in pieces. Woe to the worthless shepherd who leaves the flock. A sword shall be against his arm and against his right eye. His arm shall completely wither, and his right eye shall be totally blinded. Interestingly, in the Talmud, there is a part in Bereshit Rabbah that says this prophecy belongeth to the Messiah. This was understood as messianic even back then, but again, it's a subversion. This is really a rebuke on the priests, these leadership of Israel, who are betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. They are rejecting the true shepherd for 30 pieces of silver. And again, this makes it a point of no return, because it's the priests who lead Israel. Now, the priests have been failing in their role for hundreds of years at this point. But ultimately, the rulership of Israel doesn't fall to the Pharisees or to the rabbis. That's not their job. The job of leading Israel falls to the priests, just as it did in Tanakh to the kings of Israel and Judah. And just because they're failing doesn't mean that it's still not their responsibility. They are the shepherds of Israel, the covenant is with them, and they're failing at it. And ironically, they think they're caring for Israel when they betray Jesus, or when they ask you, or when Judas offers and they accept to sell Jesus out. I mean, remember Caiaphas' prophecy. It is expedient that one man should die for the nation. They think they're being shepherds, but what they're actually doing is breaking the bond between God and the nation of Israel. This is the climax, as it were, of the cycle of redemptive history, as we talked about with the parable of the wicked vine dressers. It's also interesting to note that the 30 pieces of silver that the shepherd is paid in Zechariah is given to the potter. This is what will happen to the money that Judas returns to them. It buys a potter's field. So, interesting little tidbit. But moving ahead, and I'm sorry I've been taking so long. This is going to have to. I'm going to have to control myself as we move into this, because this is genuinely one of my favorite parts of the Bible, in the sense that the Passover accounts. This is such an illustration to me of how the idea of there's an Old Testament and a New Testament, while technically true, the functional Marcionism, as one of the professors at Fort Wayne puts it, that leads us to think of the Old Testament as truly old and unnecessary. That functional Marcionism, quote unquote, really leaves us so much poorer, because we don't understand and we don't see what it is that happens here at Passover. So let's get right into the Passover account, Luke 22, verses 7 through 13. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat. So they said to him, Where do you want us to prepare? And he said to them, Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you, carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, The teacher says to you, Where is the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large furnished upper room. There make ready. So they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Few words about Passover. As I've said before, it is the highest feast of the Jewish calendar. It is the Jewish New Year. It begins their ecclesiastical year still, even though we now have Rosh Hashanah for our quote-unquote secular year. But the head of the ecclesiastical year is still Passover. It is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals alongside Shavuot and Sukkot. Pentecost and the Feast of Booths. Passover is so important because it celebrates Israel's deliverance. It celebrates the true birth of their independent nation. Remember, they went down a relatively small number into Egypt, but out of Egypt emerges a mighty nation, just as God had promised Abraham. Through Passover, God has cemented his covenantal relationship with Israel, and it's a remembrance and a celebration of all of God's promises to them. So Passover begins on the 15th of the month of Nisan, after cleansing houses of leaven on the 14th. 14th is the day of preparation, and the sacrifice of the paschal lamb occurs on the 14th, and then in the evening of the 14th it becomes the 15th, because Jewish days begin in the evening because of Genesis saying, and there was evening and there was morning the first day, and that's when Passover begins. There is some debate, and it is relatively easily solved, because in the three synoptic gospels, including Luke, they say that the Last Supper that we're about to read about occurs on the day that the Passover feast must be killed, but then St. John refers to Jesus dying on the day of preparation of the Passover. This is relatively easily explained in the fact that Jesus dies on a Friday, which is the day of preparation for the Sabbath. So it is the day of preparation of the Passover. It is the day of preparation for the Sabbath that happens during the Passover. That's all that means. So this is the 14th into the 15th of Nisan. It is the beginning of the feast. Now, Passover had to be celebrated in Jerusalem, but what technically counted as Jerusalem was kind of expanded because you could not house every single Israelite and proselyte in the actual city proper. There were suburbs that were considered as good as the city for the purpose of fulfilling the commandment. So to celebrate the feast actually in the city, especially when you are like Jesus and you're not especially rich, you're not a local, you're from Galilee, the worst, that wouldn't happen, because even some of the richest had to resort to borrowing porches and rooftops to keep the feast together. A little bit of linguistic interest. When Jesus says to ask them for a guest room, the Greek word is katalima. I believe that's how you pronounce that. I could be pronouncing it wrong. My Greek is terrible. But this is the same word that Luke uses earlier for the inn where there was no room for Mary and Joseph. It normally means an inn or something similar. So they ask for something humble, and yet they are granted the place of honor, the upper room. So this is itself an illustration of what Jesus has already said. Who humbles himself will be exalted. Who exalts himself will be humbled. It's generally believed that this house was the house of Mark the Evangelist, also known as John Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, the companion of St. Peter, one of the 70 disciples. We don't know this for a fact, but we have church traditions that stretch all the way back to before 100 AD that tell us this, and the Gospel of Mark itself seems to kind of suggest it. But just a bit of interesting note here. Passover, as celebrated at the time of Jesus, centers around the temple sacrifice. Once the sacrifice is made, you have 7 days of feasting and rejoicing. Worth noting here now, because this has become kind of a trend even in the LCMS to try to, I'll put it politely and say, cosplay as Jews and hold little Passover seders, which at best are misguided and at worst deeply offensive. I have never seen one that wasn't put on by a converted Jew that wasn't at best kind of awful, and at worst just blatantly illustrates that you have no idea what Passover is. Because Passover, as a lot of these seders put it, they draw from the modern conception, the post-Templar conception of Passover, because the seder is in many ways a post-Templar invention. There were seders at the time of Christ, but it would not resemble the seders we hold now. In fact, even as a Christian Jew, there are some parts of the Seder you have to cut out, or at the very least explain, because they talk about the expectation of the Messiah and the expectation of Elijah, which both have already come. And there are additions like a lamb shank bone and the egg on the Seder plate that reflect the fact that the temple is gone. So Passover has some mourning in it, even though it has an origin as a rejoicing feast, because the purpose of Passover as it existed at the time of Christ had gone away. So I'm not trying to insult people who enjoy the Seder. I do it myself. I've held them at my house since I was very young, in fact. But if you've ever been invited to a Seder, if you ever observed one, especially if a Jewish person wasn't putting it on, you did not observe something that was remotely akin to what Jesus would have done. So we've arrived to the 14th of Nisan, beginning the 15th in the evening, and Jesus would have begun a Seder. But it's going to look a lot different, that Seder in the upper room, than we expect it to look. For starters, it's not going to be this. One, why are they all sitting at the same side of the table? Obviously, the answer is because it's art. It's not supposed to reflect truth. But because art influences how we think, and we're now 2,000 years on, we don't really know what it would look like. We don't really think about what it would look like because that's not part of our everyday experience. But we do know what it would have looked like. It would have looked something like this. Even in ancient Jerusalem, in a rich man's house, there wasn't going to be a ton of room in an upper room. They'd have sat around a relatively small table, and they'd have been reclining on couches, essentially, or something more akin, honestly, to yoga mats or sleeping bags. They would recline while they ate. This is actually a part of the Seder, one of the most ancient parts, the 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? On all other nights we stand or sit. Why this night do we recline? So, in fact, if you even look at modern Orthodox, you'll see that they also recline at the Passover table. You can see that right here. And this is just another reflection of what it would have most likely looked like for Jesus. Based on the gospel accounts, we do have almost a map of what would have been going on here. So we have the table here, Jesus here, John on his right, Judas on his left, Peter kind of across him at a diagonal. We don't know who of the other 12 are in the middle. We have, in this legend, you can see that the heads are facing towards the table, feet are facing away from it, just as you would have seen in this picture. So, as I said, the modern Seder is very distinct from what would have happened at Jesus' time, but there are some things that are preserved. We know this. And what you would have seen in a first century Seder would have involved certain essential elements. First off, as always, that have been the retelling and expositing and teaching about the Exodus and what it means. There would have been 4 cups of wine, each reflecting a different ceremonial meaning about deliverance. And you had to drink all 4 of them. Yes, this means kids too. There would have been matzah, unleavened bread. There would have been maror and chazaret, the bitter herbs. There would have been haroset, which is a sweet fruit paste representing the mortar of Egypt. And there would have been salt water or vinegar representing the tears of the slaves in Egypt. Many of these were combined together to create what was called the sop. It is also colloquially known as the Hillel sandwich. This had become a part of practice at this time because Hillel had done it, and you would pass it around, or you'd all make one yourself, depending on your particular practice. It was designed to show, this is the fullness of the experience, the redemption and the pain in one thing. So we do know some of what would have gone into a first century Seder, but we can't necessarily replicate it because, for one thing, we definitely can't replicate the sacrifice. They would have been eating their sacrifices at this moment. But we could spend a long time talking about the Seder. Again, I certainly could. It's one of my favorite parts of the Bible, but that's not what we're here to do. So Luke chapter 22, verses 14 through 23. When the hour had come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. Then he said to them, "With fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." Then he took the cup and gave thanks, and said, "Take this, and divide it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Likewise also he took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. And truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed." Then they began to question among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing. So we see here that the Eucharist, the communion, the Lord's Supper, Eucharist meaning Thanksgiving, is established as a part of the Seder. Jesus fulfills the old and establishes the new at the same time. He exposits on the meaning of specific blessings and meditations that are tied to matzah and wine in Passover, and then he fulfills them and gives us something new. Matzah in the Seder is broken before the meal commences. This is part of that stuff we can actually trace back. From the other Gospels, we can infer that the wine that Jesus uses is the third of the 4 cups. It's called the cup of blessing. And then after this, they would sing psalms, including Psalm 126. So Jesus establishes the Lord's Supper throughout the Seder, which again makes sense because Seders are not rituals per se. There is a Haggadah, there is something you read and follow along with, but it's not like church. It's an opportunity for teaching. In fact, the modern Seder very much revolves around children because you're supposed to pass this on to your children. So Jesus is taking it as a teaching opportunity, as he so often does. Eucharist, Passover, and what we call Easter in the Western Church. In the East, it's called Pascha, which is Passover in Aramaic, and I believe it has come over as a cognate into certain forms of Greek. This all goes to show they are so intimately connected. What Jesus is doing is Passover, but whereas the first Passover was passing over the children of Israel while delivering judgment on Egypt and freeing them, Jesus is taking all of that judgment onto himself, and he is giving the blessings and redemption to all of his people. It's worth noting that another part of the ancient Seder revolves around Exodus 13:8, where Moses tells the Israelites, "And you shall tell your son in that day, saying, 'This is done because of what the Lord did for me when I came up from Egypt.'" And we say that, when we say "for me," this is part of the Haggadah, we say "for me" because it is as if I was in Egypt. The idea was that when God delivered Israel, he delivered all of Israel, including future generations. So when you take part in the Seder and you bless God for delivering Israel from Egypt, as a first century Israelite, you are in a real way taking part in that redemption. It is as if you were there. It is a predecessor of the real presence. And it would have flown quite naturally from it. This is my body. This is my blood. If you've ever gone to Higher Things or watched any of their videos or listened to their podcasts, Pastor Borghardt likes to say, "Is means is," and that's when it says God delivers Israel, it means Israel. It doesn't mean Israel in 1000 or whatever it was BC. It means Israel, across. When Jesus says, "This is my body," he doesn't just mean then. He means across in all of the celebrations of Holy Eucharist. We know that from the other gospel accounts that Jesus, as part of the Seder, gives the sop, or the Hillel sandwich, made of lamb, matzah, and bitter herbs. It would have been dipped in salt water and vinegar, and he gives it to Judas and says, "The one to whom I give this is the one who will betray me." It's in St. Matthew. It's not here in Luke, but it's worth remembering because that's such a symbol. The bitter and the sweet of the redemption, the weight under Egypt or sin and the deliverance in the Exodus are all wrapped up in the sop. And once Judas is given this, Jesus tells him, "Go and do what you're planning to do," and Jesus runs off. And Jesus continues through the Passover and finishes it. And this is, in essence, this is the last Passover. Jesus dies after having already celebrated Passover, after having fulfilled it, or rather after having celebrated it so that he may fulfill it. It is the last Passover because it is the fulfillment of Passover, and that's why he says, I have earnestly desired to keep this Passover with you, because this is in some ways the end of the old and the beginning of the new. It's an expanding and a fulfillment. Of course, we still remember and rejoice in the deliverance from Egypt, but again, that was a shadow and a type of what Jesus comes to fulfill. At the end of the Seder, they would finish singing the Hallel, and then they would drink the 4th cup, and then what would traditionally happen after singing Psalm 118, the end of the Hallel, the Psalm of Triumphal Entry, what would traditionally happen is they would stay up. You stay up and keep talking about Scripture, you talk about the meaning of the Exodus until you fall asleep. You keep rejoicing, you keep celebrating. Of course, that's not what happens with Jesus. He ends up going to the Garden of Gethsemane. We're going to end there this week. We'll return next week to finish Luke chapter 22 and move into the account of Jesus' arrest and trial. As I said, this will be the last week, or this week was, I guess, the last week, now that we're at the end, that we focus entirely on Luke, because we are going to go through all of Jesus' trial, because it's worth going over. It's worth going over all the accounts of his death and all the accounts of his resurrection and all that happens. There's so much to go over. It is genuinely some of the most exciting things you can talk about. It is the crux. It is the crux, the center of not just all of redemptive history, but all of history, full stop. So I look forward to talking about that next week. Until then, stay safe, and I'll be back next week.